Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, host of the Angelo Robles podcast and the founder at Family Office Association. Today, we're going to cover NFTs meets carbon credits. It features Tom Herman, CEO of Metacarbon, and really excited about today, taking two incredibly interesting subjects that absolutely, as you're going to learn, could work together. We're going to go really deep with Tom. And even if you don't know too much about NFTs or carbon offsets, truly, you're going to learn it all today. And again, how in this example, at least, they came together. Before we get started, I did want to give a quick shout out to our good friend, David Talbot at Accordia, and really the whole team. There are data integration technology partners for arranging today's wonderful speaker. The energy crisis, well, that's something that we've also had a discussion with David about, and absolutely on the carbon offsets will play into that. So we're going to weave a lot into today. Why don't I at least start by being courteous? Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you today, Angelo. More simply put, a carbon credit is, or a carbon offset is someone capturing 1 ton of carbon so that someone else can emit 1 ton of carbon. You can capture a ton of carbon by planting a tree, protecting a forest, by capping a landfill that's emitting methane, by capping an old coal mine or oil wells. There are many different ways to capture methane and CO2 that would generate a carbon offset. Basically, NFTs are digital receipts. They're digital receipts that are unique and individual. In the case of crypto in general, you have fungible and non-fungible, but the rest of the world has that as well. So in the world of reality, a dollar is fungible. In many cases, although not all cases, a barrel of oil or a bushel of grain is fungible. If I have a dollar and you have a dollar, we can swap. On the other hand, my baseball card and your baseball card may not be exactly fungible because mine might be a Mickey Mantle and yours might be someone unknown, although more likely the other way around. And the same is true with real estate deeds, right? So two properties are different. They're non-fungible. My house might be bigger or smaller or in a different location and worth a different value. Well, non-fungible tokens, NFTs, are the same thing. They represent, in some cases, in the simplest of cases, they represent a piece of artwork, a digital artwork, and it uniquely identifies you as the owner. Now, someone can still rip it off, but digital rights management is not a new issue, right? So someone can rip off a Beatles song as well and put it on their iPod when they don't own it. Someone can rip off your CryptoPunk or your Bored Ape and use it, but they don't actually own it. And in fact, someone could rip off the Mona Lisa and have a very high fidelity replica in their home, but it's still not the real one. And everybody can tell, and there's a certain prestige to being the Louvre that has the real one, or being the owner of one of these more rare Bored Apes.
Your resume details, and you spoke a little bit about it, many years of experience really in two distinct disciplines. I'm going to say kind of blockchain, and now that really is encompassing Web3, NFTs, and blockchain, but let's try to keep it simple, and carbon. What is the mission that is driving you as an entrepreneur that you're seeking to address?
Well, that's interesting. So I see Metacarbon as a bridge to fund social and environmental capital flow into projects that are established to reduce carbon emissions and improve the habitats of endangered species. That's where financial and social returns are really the same. We're looking for a financial return and a social return. We seek to do well for shareholders while also doing well for society.
If a company that creates the carbon credits offsets, but who audits or checks that my credit, quote unquote, is legit?
Well, there's a softball for blockchain. Softball question for blockchain. So one of the things about the carbon industry is it's very distributed. There are carbon projects all over the world. There are measurement companies, verification companies, and reporting companies all around the world that are doing different kinds of work based on different methodologies and standards for measuring carbon and impact of investing in carbon. And there's a lot of different registries where the carbon offsets that are generated can be registered. And then on top of that, there's a whole bunch of exchanges and brokers where these offsets can be bought and sold. So this is a distributed, trustless environment, which is really perfect for blockchain. We need to be pushing on digital IDs for all of the members in the entire ecosystem, so that when you record on blockchain, $15 on a carbon offset associated with some consumer activity, that you can track that back to the exchange, to the registry, to the project, and to the measurement entities that measured the size of the trees and the height of the trees and the carbon biomass. But if we're realistic, the world is not going to stop flying today. So if you're going to continue to fly, or we're going to continue to use electricity, and we're not going to have the economy collapse, then we're going to continue to emit carbon. So the point is, we want to reduce it as much as possible. We want to reduce it as quickly as possible, but there's no reason not to be carbon neutral immediately by paying somebody else to do the opposite of emitting carbon. And that's where we get to take the power of the markets. I think that the markets can find the most cost-effective place to reduce carbon emissions in the world at any given moment. And it could be very expensive and very difficult to replace every single aircraft in the world with an electric aircraft. So that's going to take some time. But it turns out there are an enormous number of places where we can sequester and both reduce carbon emissions and sequester additional carbon in huge quantities by managing and replanting our forests. And in doing so, we can also help the local communities who are feeling the brunt of the effects of climate change and don't have the resources to address it. So by transferring wealth, by paying money to people living in the mangroves, living in the peat moss, living in the rainforests, who need help to survive, they can more cost effectively reduce global carbon emissions. And so the markets should do that. The markets should seek out everywhere on Earth and normalize pricing across carbon emissions until we get to a point where we stop. So it's really a win-win-win. But here's another thing that's amazing about blockchain. We've seen over the last 20 years, a lot of carbon and forestry projects happen. And a huge portion of the money that goes to saving these forests is just siphoned off by corruption. But with blockchain, sure, it's all transparent. You can't do that if the money is properly tagged right through to the local community who is supposed to get X% of the money to feed their kids, or to not cut trees, or to do whatever sustainable practices that they've agreed to do in exchange for money. You can see that the local government hasn't stolen half or 3/4 of the money. And while I'm on the topic of the energy industry, I just want to point out that there are a couple of companies out there in the world who excel at putting platforms out in the ocean and attaching drilling, or the equivalent of what could be a huge wind turbine on top of them. So if we think that there's no place in the future of energy for a BP or a Shell or an Exxon, we're wrong. We need those companies. We need to set up incentives for those companies to go and do different things. They're going to behave based on the incentives that we as voters and the government give them. They just want to make money, and they're amazing engineers. As long as we're on the topic of supply chains, and we're here to talk about blockchain, once again, blockchain is going to allow tremendous transparency into the supply chain. And when coupled with carbon offsets, you can start shipping LNG gas offshore and attaching carbon offsets using blockchain, and be able to at least deliver the natural gas in a carbon neutral fashion. So Air Carbon is currently doing that a lot. They work with shippers in the LNG gas industry to attach carbon offsets as part of the LNG contract.
Is offsetting enough? Meaning, can carbon offsets be combined with Scope 1 reductions?
They should be, because you're not going to reduce your Scope 1 to 0 very immediately. So you really should do both. You should offset and reduce. It's going to be extremely difficult to get to net zero without offsets. I would say most companies it's going to be impossible. The airline industry is going to take decades. What I could say is that Exxon has an opportunity to participate in what is going to be the largest change in human society in ever, probably the fastest, largest change. As we decarbonize our society under threat of storms and wildfires and droughts and heat waves, it's going to be extremely fast change. And as I said, Exxon really knows how to go offshore and drill holes in the bottom of the ocean, and they could be putting up pylons for wind turbines. These companies have tremendous engineering skills. Who better to sequester? We're going to continue to use hydrocarbons for a while, right? So who better to sequester the carbon emissions associated with oil and gas than companies who are already drilling holes underground? So we can just be all Pollyanna about it and say, well, everyone should stop using carbon immediately. We should go off of fossil fuels immediately. But that's not realistic. As much as I'd like to see that happen, that's just not a realistic perspective. The world economy would come to a halt and a lot of people would starve to death. So that's also not a great option. So how do we, again, I'm back to the same topic. How do we enlist BP, Shell, Exxon, and all the other big petrochemical companies to help us solve the problem? And if Exxon finds the right solution, they will grow again.
What's the size of the carbon market today compared to, say, 5 years ago?
Well, I'd say like in the last year or so, the compliance carbon markets were on the order of $200 billion a year. I would say the voluntary markets, the last report I said showed that they would be at about 50 billion a year by 2030, but I think that's a vast understatement. I think the voluntary carbon markets are growing rapidly. There's been tremendous demand from consumers and companies in voluntary carbon markets. So I think the voluntary carbon markets could be $100 billion, maybe more by the end of the decade. The kind of carbon offsets that I deal with, different people want different ones. So if I'm working on a consumer product for Starbucks or Tim Hortons, they're going to want to be getting carbon offsets associated with the coffee growing districts of Colombia, Brazil, North Africa, and Indonesia. Whereas if I'm working with someone like IKEA, they may want carbon offsets associated with the spotted owls of the northern boreal forest where the wood pulp comes from. Every voluntary offsetter is going to have really specific needs around what they want and what vintages and so forth.
When it comes to the compliance markets and involuntary markets, what is the distinction and why are there two different marketplaces that are required?
Yeah, so on the compliance side, most countries have certain industries that are required to emit a certain amount or less. So as a result, you have markets like the California cap and trade. We've got the RGGI markets around energy production in New England. We've got the offset-based pricing in Canada. They've got the EUA system in Europe, and many different countries have these. So if you're in high intensity carbon industries, making cement, steel, electricity, et cetera, you have to cap your emissions. And if you don't, then you need to buy offsets. And those offsets fit into very specific fungible buckets. There are certain types of projects, certain vintages, which meet the compliance requirements. On the voluntary side, this is pressure from consumers and just general desire on behalf of corporations and individuals to offset. So they can buy anything they want. They can buy high quality, they can buy low quality, they can buy a lot, they can buy a little, but they tend to care a lot more about what the offset is, as opposed to just wanting to make sure that it meets the minimum requirements. Additionality is a really key item in the carbon space. So if you're going to offset your carbon emissions, you want to make sure that the money that you're putting into those carbon offsets is going to change behavior, to remove additional carbon from the atmosphere. You don't want your money to be going into doing something that would happen anyway. So that's what a really low quality one. You might pay 50 cents a ton for carbon emissions associated with a profitable solar panel, when instead you could be paying $15 a ton for an unprofitable cook stove in a hut in Africa. Air Carbon has a two-way bridge. They tokenize, they take your carbon offsets, they sequester them in a bankruptcy remote custody provider, and then they issue you a digital receipt. And that digital receipt is a token. You can trade that token. You can trade it on their platform. Potentially, you could take it off their platform and trade it somewhere else. But if anyone wants to take physical delivery of the carbon offsets, they need to bring it back to the original platform that did the tokenization, turn in that token, burn the token, and then they get the carbon offsets back. It'd be the same thing if you wanted to go pick up corn or oil or gold. You can take a physical delivery of your commodity. But one of the things that surprised me, I expected it would be harder to find buyers. And in fact, it's turned out to become more and more difficult to find sellers. The carbon markets are short. And when I started Metacarbon, a number of people, including one of my investors, who had told me that one of the reasons they were investing is because they wanted me to buy carbon offsets from them, said, we're not going to really sell much in the way of carbon offsets. We're holding pat, and we think it's best to be long carbon. And so just in the 4 months that I've been running Metacarbon, I've seen the price of carbon go from $8 to over $15 a ton in the kind of forestry projects I'm looking at.
You're the CEO and founder of Metacarbon. Can you tell us a little bit about what your company does and effectively what their mission is?
Sure. Mostly what we're doing right now is having fun. I mean, what an amazing space to be in. To be at the intersection of NFTs and carbon is just super exciting. There's so much cool stuff going on. Basically, what we're doing is we're using NFTs, collectible NFTs, to raise money for habitats for endangered species. More or less, that's how it works. But why have we chosen to do it through carbon offsets? And 40% of the revenue that's generated from this NFT sales go to purchasing carbon offsets. But the carbon offset industry is really well defined in terms of what's the quality, how is it measured, what kinds of impact does it have? And our view is that consumers who want to invest in carbon offsetting want to be able to have transparency and understand exactly what the impact of their dollars is. So when we choose carbon offsets to purchase associated with our NFTs, we look at which sustainable development goals are being addressed by the carbon offsets. What kinds of extra certifications do they have? And then we gamify that process. So our NFTs are 32 different endangered animals. And each animal has a number of different traits, one of which is the SDGs that they address. Another is the endangered status. And we allow people to collect these NFTs, these carbon creatures, and they can level them up or power them up in a gaming concept by putting more carbon offsets into them. That allows us to start having some interesting competition. But our roadmap includes things like allowing carbon creature owners that have more than one creature to do breeding. So if you have 2 carbon creatures, you can breed them and have an airdrop of a baby carbon creature. There's a lot of different things within the carbon ecosystem that we'll be turning into NFTs. But all of it is really in an effort to increase the transparency from the point of sale and the consumer right back down to the impact at the ground, wherever the carbon offset is coming from.
In terms of the development of your company and how people could be active in, and you have it now in the backdrop of your green screen, like how could one go about buying one, for lack of a better word?
If you want to buy one of our NFTs, and maybe for some of your audience, this would be the first NFT that they buy. We allow you to do it with a credit card, and we allow you to do it with ETH or Matic, or another token called pearl.eco. And if you have a wallet, we're on the Polygon network, which has very, very small carbon footprint and very, very low transaction fees. So there's no gas costs to the buyer. If you have a wallet, we'll drop your NFT into your wallet in a more typical minting process. That you might have seen with Bored Apes or Fluff Bunnies or CryptoPunks. But if you don't, we set up proxy wallets. when you look at the NFT market, you've really got to look at a few different things. I think most of these projects are going to go to zero, but the ones that aren't are the ones that are trying to generate genuine utility. Either they're associated with long-standing brands like NBA Top Shot, or they're trying to associate themselves with long-standing brands like Bored Apes trying to get involved in the music industry.
Yes, they are.
Right?
It's
That's
pretty
interesting.
crazy.
But many of them are just like squiggles and other kinds of weird artwork that, you know, are kind of interesting, but I don't see them as having long-term
Okay,
value.
let me bounce around that one a little bit. I mean, I could look at contemporary art if I was an old guard perceptive from the 1950s saying, what the hell is this shit? So
Yeah.
I think the word intrinsic value and utility could, I'm not saying it's always wrong, but it could be overrated. When it comes to the world of art, does the Mona Lisa have any intrinsic value? It's
You're absolutely right.
I like to look at it.
I can't argue with you, but my opinion is that most of this artwork is really not particularly compelling artwork. It's just someone who decided to do generative art, came out with an outline and a bunch of things they put on top of it. And if they don't take it to the next level, if they don't have a roadmap towards bringing value to the owners, then, you know, I don't see the long-term value. There are some iconic artists who broke the mold when they did whatever piece of art that they did that just, like, you know, changed the world or changed the world of art. And I think that you're going to see that a few of these NFT artists are that. I do believe that the crypto punks and that the Bored Apes are going to be seen as iconic turning points in a new form of artwork that are going to have intrinsic long-term value. But there are thousands of wannabes. And one of the things I like about my carbon creatures is that although they have really high quality 3D art that's in 3D environments, that's going to be able to be animated and played with and so forth, we also have a real utility. This is a consumer interface for a carbon accounting platform that adds a lot of value to addressing climate change and engaging brands and engaging the customers of a brand in addressing the issue of climate change. So that's our primary goal. Maybe I didn't even say that, but Carbon Creatures, or Metacarbon in general, is designed to help brands engage their consumers, brands and celebrities and influencers, engage their communities on the topic of climate change. We're a B2B2C.